Please don't tell me that mic was off the whole time. Oh no. Do I need to go back and read? Anyone want to talk? Thinking I might have to go back and read again. Which would be fine because I have plenty of time. Shall I go back and read it again? Anyone? Hello? Maybe I'll go back and read it again. Let's see, where were we? Take the glasses off. Found it. Okay, let's try this again. Hopefully the mic stays on this time. The honeymoon week ended, and we had to emerge from our private world. On the morning of departure, Julian received a letter from his stepmother, saying that Smithers the coachman would meet us at Rye, and that she looked forward to meeting her daughter-in-law, who she felt sure was as lovely as he declared. We saw the notice in the London Gazette. I was glad your letter preceded it, although by so few hours. I asked what she meant, that there could only be one answer. Julian had not written to his family about our marriage until the last minute, when he knew the announcement was to appear in the Gazette. This explained the absence of any greetings from them on our wedding day, a fact which had troubled me, but which I had also excused. His father was incapable of writing, and his aunt no doubt too much occupied with nursing him to have time to do so. As for his stepmother, I thought she could hardly be expected to be enthusiastic over the marriage of a son who was not really her own, and too busy in the midst of all her responsibilities to spare a moment to pen a line of congratulation and good wishes. Did that last time, didn't I? I had reiterated all these excuses in my mind and suppressed a feeling of uneasiness because it was necessary to do so. But now that uneasiness had returned 100-fold. "You didn't let them know until the last minute?" I accused. "Why? Were you ashamed of our marriage? Of me?" "Of course not. But it all happened so quickly." "You wanted it that way. You set the pace. And even so, there was time to write to your family." "I did write." "Doesn't Miriam's letter prove that?" "But not until you were forced to. Just in time to prevent them from learning the news from another source." It was our first quarrel, and mercifully brief. There was one way in which Julian could terminate or forestall any dissension between us, and he did it now, eagerly, determinedly, pushing me down onto the bed. Our bags were packed. Soon the cab would be at our door. Let it wait, let it wait. As our senses merged, there was no divisions, no separateness, no demarcation lines between love and sexual desire. I had learned, and was still learning, that in marriage the one sparked the other. And because I had been reared without any hypocritical taboos, I was able to give myself with the unthinking delight. But when finally we set out on the journey, something occurred to me that made me feel I was married to a stranger. As Julian paid off the cab at the rail depot and gave instructions to a porter about our bags, brushing aside others who scrambled to serve us in order to pick up a shilling, I glanced around and was horrified by what I saw. I had heard that prostitutes haunted rail depots in London, even those now being built in the outer suburbs, but my journeys to and from Bedlington Grange had always been early in the day. Now it was late afternoon, but they were here in droves. Their young old faces stamped with a kind of universal weariness, and a hardness born of desperation. Hunger was in their eyes, despair in their voices, as they called bodily to each other or hurled abuse at the head of one who had managed to catch a customer from under their noses. Some were little more than children, with wizened monkey faces, hollow cheeks, dark ringed eyes. Some actually were children, dragged by the hand of some evil-looking crone and offered blatantly to any passing man. Some were mothers, old before their time, gaunt with starvation, clad in rags so unappetizing that they were brushed aside like vermin. And when Julian pushed one begging creature out of his way contemptuously, I felt almost stunned with shock. He took hold of my arm and shepherded me through the crowd. I couldn't look at him, but I knew he was looking at me. I knew also that my face had blanched. He asked gently, "Darling, what's the matter?" "It's all this." He nodded indifferently. "I know, but it's about time they cleaned up our rail depots. But I don't suppose they ever will." "But some are children, and others little more. And that poor creature you brushed aside. How could you?" He looked surprised. "You surely didn't expect me to do anything else." "She looked half-starved. Even a sixpence would have helped." He said patiently, "My dear Eustacia, there are soup kitchens to help the good poor. Unfortunately, the bad poor outnumber them by thousands." "Is there a difference between good poor and bad poor?" I choked with indignation, realizing for the first time the sufferings Michel must have endured when turned out onto the streets of London, in this day and age. The biggest city in the world, and the richest. I was appalled that such poverty could be allowed to exist in the capital of the most extensive empire known to history, with the vaults of the Bank of England stacked with more gold bars than there were in any other country, and its gold sovereigns, more common than the paper pound note, eagerly accepted all over the world. Evidently my feelings were reflected in my face, for as Julian led me to the ticket barrier, he said with a touch of impatience, "If it shocks you, don't look. If you don't like it, don't think about it." I lacked my husband's ability to dismiss the unpleasant, and was silent for the greater part of the journey, distressed by what I had seen, and even more by Julian's attitude toward it. Lady Miriam's letter worried me too, and as we travelled through the Sussex Weald, I began to think about it again. To me it had seemed to hold an undercurrent of reproach. To Julian it had seemed merely affectionate, putting his mind at ease. That fact alone was disturbing. I asked anxiously, "You weren't worried about your family's reaction to our marriage, were you? You weren't afraid that they would not welcome me?" "Now, don't start that again, Stacy." He went on to assure me that never for a moment had he harbored the slightest doubt, and this seemed to be proved by his increasing eagerness as the journey progressed, so that I knew he was looking forward to presenting me to his family, and that all my doubts and apprehensions had been unnecessary. They had been no more than those which any bride feels when faced with the ordeal of meeting her unknown in-laws. I was bolstered by his pride in me. "They'll adore you the moment they see you, as I did, my darling," and by an undercurrent of excitement within him, a gay, almost devilish excitement which seemed to increase the closer we came to Dragonmead. But my own reaction to the place was one for which I was totally unprepared. I experienced a feeling of unaccountable recognition, which was in no way due to Julian's description of my future home. All he told me was that it had been in the family for generations, and that compared with the house in Bloomsbury, I would no doubt find it rather different, but would soon get used to it. Therefore I knew it was old, and since it was a family home in the country, anticipated that it would be quiet and dignified, but not immense, overpowering, and above all frightening. Not a house, but a mansion, gaunt, cold, and forbidding. A mansion encircled by vast acres, surrounded by fortress-like walls. For this I was indeed unprepared, as I was for the uncanny sensation that I had been there before, and an instinctive desire to escape as quickly as possible. Michel would have had some psychic explanation for it, either that I had visited Dragonmead in an earlier life, or was now fulfilling some long-forgotten premonition that I should do so. At both ideas I would have scoffed. Nevertheless, as the brougham swept round the broad apex of the drive towards wide stone steps and an impressive pillared entrance, this strange feeling of recognition increased. accompanied by an instinctive fear which I found impossible to suppress. Perhaps I had sensed that the chains of Dragonmead were to bind me fast, and that was why I had the inexplicable urge to flee from the place, as it loomed up out of the late evening mist. Massive walls looked down like grim giants, with many faces, gargoyled faces jutting out from ancient stones, growing larger and more menacing the closer we approached. The brougham halted at the foot of the steps. I glanced up them and saw imposing double doors, closed against the world. Even these seemed vaguely familiar, as if in some forgotten time I had been here before. And yet I knew it could not be true. What was true was that this immense and intimidating place suddenly seemed like a prison, which I was terrified to enter. The great doors, studded like those of a jail, swung slowly open, and from the shadowy depths beyond them the figure of a woman emerged. For a moment she looked poised at the top of the stone steps, looking down upon us. It was a dramatic appearance, and she held it effectively. I gazed up at her, somewhat awed, and knew that despite the distance between us, she was taking in every detail about me. But whether she approved or not, I had no idea, because her calm, well-bred face betrayed absolutely nothing. I became aware that Smithers had opened the door of the brougham, and Julian had descended and was holding out his hand to me. I lifted my skirts and accepted his help, descending carefully because I was terrified of making a slip before this elegant, poised, good-looking woman, who still made no movement, but stood waiting for us to approach, like a queen waiting for her new subject to be presented at her throne. Those steps leading up to the main entrance of Dragonmead seemed endless. 2 flights of deep treads, 12 in each flight. I counted subconsciously as my husband led me up them. The woman's unblinking scrutiny did nothing to put me at ease. When we reached the top, Julian exclaimed, "Miriam, you look as handsome as ever." His voice was kind, coaxing, and charming. So this was his stepmother, of whom he thought so highly. Since I knew that a man of my husband's nature could respond only to warmth in others, there had to be hidden depths in this woman which were not evinced at this moment. I sensed banked down fires quietly smoldering, and the impression was more unnerving than her icy mask. I stood hesitant, waiting to be greeted, and was thankful for the encouraging clasp of Julian's hand as he drew me forward and said a shade too brightly, "And here is Eustacia. Isn't she lovely?" "Very." Miriam Kershaw's voice was exactly as I expected, quiet, cultured, unemotional. Then she leaned very slightly toward me and unsmilingly offered her cheek to be kissed. The gesture was more remote than a handshake. I also sensed patronage in it, a royal gesture magnanimously proffered. I disliked it, but I obeyed. I kissed the cool cheek, then immediately offered my own in return. The reflex action took her by surprise, and it pleased me that she was forced to reciprocate. This immediately placed us on a level footing, and established right from the start that I would accept no queen and subject attitude. "Welcome to Dragonmead, Eustacia." The words came from her unwillingly, but they did come, and although I knew there was no welcome in them, I had to be satisfied for the time being. As we turned and went into the house, Julian slipped one hand beneath his stepmother's elbow, and the other beneath mine. His gesture to her was conciliatory, and to me encouraging, so I knew he had sensed the tension between us, and I felt he was thankful that the first stile had been crossed, and that I had scaled it with dignity. But what else did he expect me to do? Be cowed by the lady of the manor? No one had ever cowed me in my life, or ever would. I glanced up at him with a touch of defiant pride before being plunged into a situation that was impressive, but to me almost unnerving. For never before had I seen a whole household of servants lined up to greet a young heir and his bride. Here at Dragonmead they were ranged the full length of a vast and gloomy hall, so that our progress was like a royal inspection. The entire staff was there, from the highest to the lowest. Garfield, the butler, presented the men servants, and Mrs. Levitt, the housekeeper, presented the maids. I could feel the Lady Miriam's cold eyes watching me as I made acknowledgments. I felt she was waiting for me to commit some faux pas, But after an initial twinge of apprehension, I realized that all one had to do was to be courteous and pleasant, exchange a word with the principal servants, and smile at the lesser ones, conveying pleasure in meeting them. Then my sense of humor asserted itself. I was amused by the solemnity of the occasion, as we made our slow progress down the long, echoing hall, I felt that the only thing needed was sacred music. I glanced up. Sure enough, there was a minstrel's gallery. A subdued quartet or an unseen organ would not have been inappropriate, I thought, as one by one stiff male backs bowed and becapped and aproned women curtsied low, paying homage. For the household of a baronet, this retinue was large, almost worthy of an earl. I heard my mother-in-law saying that she had put us in the yellow room. Your old room would be overcrowded with a double bed in it, Julian. The yellow room is bigger and much more suitable for a married couple. It also has that beautiful view of the lake. Smithers and a boy were carrying our bags upstairs. Miriam asked in a tone of surprise, as if that was all we had. When Julian failed to answer, I looked at him and was startled by the dismay in his face. I said swiftly that our trunks were following by station wagon, added that I would like to change out of my traveling clothes, and drew Julian towards the stairs, where Mrs. Levitt, carrying an ornate silver candelabrum, was politely waiting to escort us. At that, Julian seemed to regain possession of himself. "The yellow room," he echoed heartily. "That will be splendid. Eustacia will love it, I'm sure. By the way, how is father?" "Far from well. I am afraid it will be impossible for Eustacia to be presented to him tonight. Perhaps tomorrow. Dorcas will decide." "He hasn't taken a turn for the worse, I hope?" "Not exactly worse. But, well, the shock, the surprise, the unexpectedness of it all." "You mean our wedding? He should be pleased. He has been nagging me long enough about marrying and producing an heir, or was when he was able to speak." Mrs. Levitt was mounting the stairs, her back ramrod straight, her full black skirts sweeping behind her. She was safely out of earshot, but perhaps Miriam Kershaw was afraid of echoes between those lofty stone walls, because she already dropped her voice as she answered, "Your father has an heir already. You, Julian. And after you, my son." The words sprang into my mind as if breathed into it. Was this the reason for her cool welcome of me? Was she resentful because now Julian was married, her own son's chances of inheriting Dragonmead were lessened? I took a couple of steps in Mrs. Levitt's wake, but the Lady Miriam remained at the foot of the stairs, and so did Julian. I looked back at them, aware that I was momentarily forgotten, and rather glad because it gave me an opportunity to study this woman who had not taken her eyes off me since our arrival. It was a relief to be rid of her close inspection, and I only hoped that I would not be subjected to such scrutiny when meeting the rest of my husband's family. My mother-in-law's fading blonde hair must have been once beautiful, and her features still retained a symmetry which must have been exceptional in youth. Undoubtedly, she was good-looking still, but hers were the kind of looks that one admired in the way one admires a piece of sculpture, without wishing to resemble it or even to touch it. Nevertheless, beneath her icy composure the smoldering remained. I disliked those banked out fires. I mistrusted them. Julian seemed to say something. He changed his mind, dropped a kiss lightly on his stepmother's brow, favored her with a vivid smile, then turned back to me. Together we mounted the stairs, our feet echoing on the uncarpeted stone treads. The sound, as well as the bareness, struck a chill into me. It was like climbing out of an enormous vault with darker regions above. There was no warmth anywhere and scarcely any light. Despite fluttering candles in the great wall sconces and huge fires, which, looking back, I saw blazing within deep stone hearths at each end of the hall. It was the first time I had noticed them, but now that the staff had respectfully filed away, the whole area of the dimly lit hall lay spread out below, inhabited by the only solitary figure of my mother-in-law, still watching me. Briefly our eyes met. She jerked her head away intently, and I was glad that it was she, not I, who was disconcerted. Still looking over my shoulder, I let myself be guided upstairs by Julian. This enabled me to watch my stepmother's departure, her voluminous skirts swinging gently as she glided across the solid oak floor of the hall towards a distant doorway. The only sounds were the rustle of her stiff petticoats and the almost inaudible whisper of her slippered feet. On carpets her tread would be unheard. It put me in the mind of a soft patting of a cat. At the top of the stairs Mrs. Levitt paused, and reaching up, drew down a great brass oil lamp by a pulley, applied a flame to it from one of the candles, then returned the lamp to its place beneath the carved stone canopy high above the stairwell. The spread of light revealed corridors running to the right and left. The floors up here were mercifully carpeted. The walls were paneled, and from them family portraits looked down. One glance told me that they badly needed restoring. Joseph Whitehead would never have tolerated such neglect of oil paintings. Varnishes had darkened, and surfaces deteriorated through age or damp. My fingers itched to apply a gentle solution of soap and water to remove the initial grime, and then to set to work on the restoration. Many of these portraits were masterpieces, and it would be exciting to reveal what lay beneath, to revive original colors and retouch where necessary. Prolonged work, but one that my exacting master had insisted his students learn. Julian nodded toward the portraits casually. Mostly Kershaw's, he said, but some Derwents as well. Miriam's people. Her father was Lord Derwent, eldest son of the Earl of Calverley, and of course he had inherited the title on the Earl's death. I must say my own father did well to marry into so wealthy a breed. The money saved this place, and Miriam is justly proud of all she has done for Dragonmead. The fleet of servants were installed by her. The daughter of an earl could hardly be expected to tolerate the depleted staff. That was all the Kershaws could afford. Mrs. Levitt will remember those days, he added to the housekeeper. Don't you, Mrs. Levitt? You remember the days when Dragonmead was more than half shut up? The erect figure stood to attention respectfully, and when Julian continued, "Been here all your life, haven't you, Mrs. Levitt?" she inclined her head. "I have indeed, Mr. Julian, right from my girlhood, as my mother was before me, and my grandmother before her. A fine local family, the Levitts." My husband smiled at the woman with an approval that was almost affection. Somehow I had the feeling she had more right to be here than I. "How old is the house?" I asked. "Late 16th century, 1575 to be exact. Built by that elderly gentleman in the center of the wall." Julian gestured toward a heavy gilt frame with an almost indistinguishable portrait within it. The first Sir Julian, founder of the Kershaw family, made a baronet for reasons long forgotten, and for reasons long forgotten never elevated further. In those days, even a baronet could afford to build and run a place like this. But times have changed. Now we need wives to rescue us from financial misfortune, don't we, Mrs. Levitt? "I wouldn't say that, sir." "Because you are a worthy, well-mannered servant, very much aware of your place. But I can say it, and do. So thank God for the Derwent fortune." I thought the Derwent fortune should have been stretched to preserve those valuable paintings, but all I remarked was that I would like to see the portrait of the first Sir Julian cleaned and restored. At this my husband laughed aloud. "That old thing? It isn't worth the trouble." "It is very much worth the trouble. It was probably painted by a master. Grieves me to see such valuable paintings neglected." I had forgotten you are an artist. As he took my arm again and led me down a long corridor to the right, Mrs. Levitt still lighting our way, he continued indifferently. "Personally, I find paintings of little interest. Nothing is more boring to me than an art gallery, and nothing of less interest at Dragonmead than this dreary display of ancestors. Now I am shocking you, aren't I, my love?" He pressed my arm affectionately and added in a teasing voice, "But I am glad to hear those paintings are valuable, although I would prefer to have the money. Why did artists in those days paint everything so gloomily?" "But they didn't. Most of them mixed their own pigments, and the vividness of the colors could be restored with careful handling. The portrait of the first Sir Julian, for instance. The film of surface grime could be removed, and tests made after that to discover what pigments were used. If resin was included, a mild solvent of alcohol could safely restore the original colors. It would be useless on a hardened layer of oil paint, but Julian interrupted. What a waste of good alcohol! But how fortunate am I to have such a clever wife. The mockery in his tone hurt me, and I was humiliated when he remarked to the housekeeper, Isn't she clever, Mrs. Levitt? And would you ever suspect it by looking at her? Beauty and brains. How will I ever be able to live up to such a combination? If the housekeeper saw the sensitive flush on my face, she gave no indication. She merely reached impassively in front of us and opened a door, standing aside for us to enter. Ah, the yellow room, the best room in the house, next to that of my parents. The room with the view of the lake. Come and see it, my darling. He walked to the center of the 3 tall windows, while behind me Mrs. Levitt said, I will send Lucy to unpack for you, madam. She will be your personal maid. You will find her a good girl. I trained her myself. I turned to thank her and was startled by the piercing scrutiny in eyes that previously had been discreetly blank. I felt she was surveying me with more curiosity than with criticism. I supposed it was natural enough, but it made me feel uncomfortable. Her glance was speculative, but the moment my eyes met hers, it became respectful and blank again, betraying nothing. I watched her set down the candles and move to the door. I was convinced that before she finally departed, I would receive another searching glance, and I was right. It came fleetingly but thoroughly as she was closing the door behind her. I was glad to see, too, embarrassment flicker across her face, although something told me that this stolid, poker-faced woman would never forgive me for it. Julian said impatiently, Why are you staring at the door when I'm waiting to show you the view? I'm sorry. I didn't care for the housekeeper's scrutiny. What did you expect? The servants are bound to be curious about you. You must tolerate their stares until you are accepted Dragon Maid. Accepted? Am I on trial then? We were both slightly on edge. I felt that on my part it was hardly surprising, but on Julian's I failed to understand it. He was at home here. I was not. He retorted impatiently, Don't be ridiculous, Stacy. Now come here and admire the lake. The beautiful lake that put an end to my brother's life. The note of unhappiness in his voice communicated so sharply that I went to him and slipped my hand within his, anxious to comfort him. The lake sparkled below like an enormous mirror streaked with shadows. We had arrived late, and now darkness had almost set in. In addition to the gleam of water and the surrounding shapes of trees, I could see the silhouette of an Italian arbor set on a small island. The scene was beautiful, but involuntarily I suppressed a shiver, for in my imagination I saw a body floating there, face down, the water lapping the back of a man's head. I walked away from the window, untying my bonnet with fingers that were suddenly unsteady. Then I shed my cloak and turned to smooth my hair before the dressing-table mirror. Julian was still standing beside the window, staring fixedly outside, and I knew he wasn't even aware that I was near. The knock on the door was almost like a reprieve, breaking a spell that threatened to separate us. A maid entered, who I guessed was Lucy. She carried more candles, and behind her came 2 undermaids, bearing a steaming tub of water. Lucy bobbed a curtsy. I thought Madame would wish to take a bath after her journey. As she spoke, she crossed the room and drew a heavy tapestry back, revealing an alcove rather like a roulette in a French chateau, containing a hip bath, a screen, a table bearing a pitcher and bowl, and a wooden rack with towels. While the maids emptied the hot water into the bath, Lucy set down the candles, then began to unpack my carpet bag. And for there I'm going to stop, because it is 3 o'clock. I have things to attend to. I will be back at 2 o'clock next week. If you like this, please find me on Facebook. Chat me up in the chat room here. And if you'd like it at a different time, just please say so, and I definitely will accommodate. For now, this has been Storytime with Lady Anna, and I bid you adieu.